The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Vesey from the state of Texas for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and so glad that we're holding this important hearing today, particularly on energy security. I think that energy security, our environment, the air that we breathe is something that we can never, quite frankly, talk enough about. And one of the things that have really been worrying me lately is China. We know that China has been under very strict COVID lockdown. They're probably going to quote unquote reopen here sometime soon, and I was hoping that maybe Mr. McNally could tell me what he thinks China reopening is going to do for, as far as prices are concerned. What sort of upward surge in prices might that pose on the American public?
Yes, sir. Congressman Vesey, thank you for the question. That's my bread and butter. So oil prices, our pump prices, have been in a tug of war between this Russian disruption risk, which makes them go up, and this macroeconomic weakness risk, which makes them go down. China was on the macro weakness side until the end of last year because, as you noted, they were in severe lockdowns, their demand was depressed, and very importantly, China's a big exporter of refined products like diesel and gasoline. That helped gasoline prices get to $5 a barrel. However, sir, to your question, as we come into this year, President Xi has decided to let COVID run rampant, burn through, so that by the second quarter, we and most analysts think that China will be recovering back to its pre-COVID demand level. That means close to about 16 million barrels a day. The big chunk that has to come back is jet fuel if they let their citizens start to fly. So that would all else equal put upward pressure on prices. You've seen prices started to rise. Now we have to go back and look and see what happens with Russia, because like boy who cried wolf, we didn't see the disruption last summer, but we might going forward. So China's return is sort of switch sides in the tug of war from being a downward price factor to being an upward price factor, sir.
Yeah, and some reports are even saying that we could get to about 101 million barrels a day, which would be a record for the world. And so one of the things that I've heard a lot from my friends on the other side, on the majority side, is that we need to unleash all of this energy that we have. And, you know, I'm proud to say that as a Texan, you know, we do a pretty good job of unleashing. Not only have we revolutionized things in the fracking area, but we've also been one of the world leaders when it comes to renewable energy. About 25% or so of ERCOT's grid is renewable energy. So I think that we're doing it right there. But when I hear about unleashing American energy and being energy independent, one area that continues to really hurt the U.S. Congress, and we haven't been able to find any sort of compromise on, is the issue of immigration. And if you talk to people in the Permian Basin and you talk to people that run the oil and gas companies, a lot of people don't realize this, but the permits that ranchers use, agriculture, the permits that hospitality use, those same immigration permits are not the ones that are needed for people to have temporary work visas in the oil and gas sector. And so when you talk to people in the oil and gas field, you know, people that are working, that say, hey, we need more swabbing units, we need more rigs. Guess what? You ain't unleashing a thing unless you do something about immigration reform. And so when you hear people talk about being able to unleash, you can't unleash anything if the dog don't have a handler. So please, can you please tell me, how are we going to unleash all of this energy potential if the other side is not willing to work with us on immigration reform and will continue to use this as sort of a wedge between the American people and offer absolutely no sort of solution?
Congressman, I will step around the landmine of immigration and the border and so forth, and just concur, though, that what I hear the same thing from my clients drilling in your state and others, that its input costs are really high, and part of that is finding good people. We're scouring Sri Lanka now. All over the world, they're trying to bring workers in, and steel tariffs have raised the cost of steel and casing and so forth. So there are real supply-side pressures that your constituents are dealing with, my clients are dealing with, and Congress ought to look across the board at how to alleviate those, but I'm going to steer clear of immigration, sir, if you don't mind.
Yeah, and before I get ready to turn back over my time, Mr. Chairman, I will just say, if we really want to address this issue and we really want to unleash we better do something about immigration reform, because just saying unleash and not addressing immigration reform means absolutely nothing.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Arizona, Ms. Lesko, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm really excited to be on the Energy and Commerce Committee and on the Energy Subcommittee and talking about energy, because it's vital to every aspect of our lives. I represent the Phoenix, Arizona area and its suburbs, and right outside of my district is the Palo Verde nuclear plant. It is the largest power producer in the nation for almost the last 30 years. Recently, last year, Palo Verde nuclear plant in Arizona was awarded funds from the Department of Energy to increase its flexibility by creating hydrogen when selling to the grid isn't economical. My question, Mr. Daber, what more needs to happen to increase the deployment of energy technology like hydrogen?
So we awarded the money and around increasing hydrogen production across the nuclear facilities. Hydrogen is a storage vehicle. So if you think about it, the comparison, you produce electricity and you can store it in chemical form, or you can store it in gaseous form, so in hydrogen, or you can do it in liquids, as I was talking about earlier. And so hydrogen has a great opportunity for an additional storage. The other thing that's really, really exciting about hydrogen is that some industrial uses cannot really use electricity, okay? So the likelihood of electrifying certain industries is quite poor, right, around certain things like steel and concrete. So if you can take that electricity and put it into something that can produce a much higher heat rate for that manufacturing, it's going to create an opportunity for those industrial to, quote, electrify, but it's electrify via converting it to hydrogen.
Exciting. That's the one thing I like about energy. A lot of new technology going on, exciting, that I think can solve a lot of our energy needs in America. Mr. McNally, in your written and verbal testimony, you recommended the establishment of a National Commission on Energy Transition Realism, an expert, nonpartisan commission of renowned energy experts to advise government officials and evaluate policy options for energy transmissions. I love it. I think it's common sense. Sounds like a great idea to me. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UNIPCC, in a report issued last year, pointed out that collectively the G20 members are not on track to meet their goals under the Paris Climate Agreement. The UNIPCC also states in its latest assessment that global warming at the end of the century is estimated at 2.7 degrees Celsius, not even close to the Paris Climate Agreement of 1.5 degrees. The Biden administration is spending trillions of dollars on solutions that are not working, according to the UNIPCC. Don't you think it's time the administration has an honest conversation on spending trillions of dollars on ideas that, according to the UNIPCC, aren't working?
Thank you, Congressman Lesko. I certainly do. I see a sound and serious climate policy as having a foundation, like a house has a foundation. And the quality of the foundation will determine whether this house is safe to build in and live in and so forth. And the foundation ought to be depoliticized transmission of science to non-experts like all of us. And the concern with the IPCC reports, actually, and the Summary for Policymakers, the SPM, is the folks who are decoding the complicated climate science and explaining it to all of us are government officials. And they don't have the rigorous peer review and requirements to be transparent like you do in actual climate science. So I'd respectfully suggest that perhaps your side of the aisle, make it very clear you embrace climate science. The problem is not climate science. It's how it's transmitted to the rest of us, because it's pretty complicated, in these IPCC reports. And let's have reforms to make sure it's honest, peer-reviewed, and a good foundation upon which for us to debate sound policies to address the problem.
Fantastic. And in the 13 seconds I have left, thank you for being here once again and telling us and representing low-income communities and minority communities and speaking up. Thank you. And I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Soto from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. There are a few elephants in the room worth mentioning. The Washington Post reports today, oil companies post record-smashing profits as gas prices creep up. Record-smashing profits. ExxonMobil, $55.7 billion in 2022, a record. Chevron, $36.5 billion in 2022, another record. Inflation, corporate greed, record profits, share buybacks. Something this committee needs to keep in mind as we're navigating this. Elephant number 2, climate change demands our attention. Intensifying hurricanes, massive floods, prolonged droughts, rising seas, extreme heat, extreme cold. Climate is changing, and it takes more than just saying the word climate or delay to actually solve it. The Inflation Reduction Act is now law. This committee should join the President and the Senate in shepherding a fair implementation of this landmark law, pursuing diversifying our energy production with clean, renewable energy. Number 3, exporting oil abroad. There used to be a ban on that, and now oil is being exported and Americans are paying high prices at the pump. This isn't an America First policy. This is the exact opposite. If you want to kickstart American energy dominance, we should start by looking at the exports that just started just a few years ago. Undersecretary Dabber, what do you think we should do about record oil profits at the expense of the American people?
Yes, Congressman, it's almost ironic that when a few years ago, when we were the energy dominance side on the oil markets and the gas markets, that the oil and gas companies were actually making very low profits. And the biggest problems when that was going on, when we had so much production, was that the prices had been dropped so much for the consumer. And it's a funny dialogue, right? So that when we've been supportive of export terminals and pipelines and so on, that actually the oil and gas companies make less money, and consumers actually pay less money. But when we put lots of restrictions on them and there's lots of turmoil, prices go up and then emissions go up, right? Emissions are because of coal plants coming online, especially in Germany. So it is a funny dynamic around those different issues.
Well, thanks. I appreciate you describing the issue, but it would be helpful for some solutions on it. Dr. Cohen, a key role for this committee is implementing the $369 billion in incentives to boost renewable energy, boost conservation. What are some of the things you think this committee can do to help with that fair implementation?
Thank you for the question. We've talked a lot about the importance of the grid, and both the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act have important provisions to help improve the resilience of the grid and expand it. I think that is an area that this committee can give some really close attention to. In addition, there are a number of other, we've also talked about nuclear power. And both the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act provide ways to keep our current nuclear power, to support currently operating nuclear power plants that are safe to operate. I think taking a look at that will be important so we keep that carbon-free emission coming. And then, as we've talked about, just the deployment, making sure the deployment of wind, solar, the electric vehicle infrastructure is happening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cohen. I, like many on this committee, agree it should be an all-of-the-above solution, and we should look at different sources of energy. I hope the mistakes of the past with the Affordable Care Act of trying to eliminate it for many, many years, only for it to be continue to be the law of the land. Over 3 million Floridians now get their care from there, that we learn from those mistakes when we look at the Inflation Reduction Act, knowing that it is the law and will be the law for the foreseeable future. And rather than trying to undermine it, we should work together on maximizing it. And under the Inflation Reduction Act, we do have incentives for things like modular nuclear and carbon capture in there. So for colleagues who are talking about it as if it's all just renewable energy, that actually is false. There's a great opportunity for us to work together to pursue these in this committee, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Crenshaw from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for hosting this hearing. Thank you all for being here. You know, we heard earlier that Republican priorities are misguided, and that was a little shocking because I think our priorities are guided quite well and are very clear. And they're this: provide energy to the American people that fits 3 criteria: reliable, affordable, and clean. I don't think that's very controversial. Reliability is number 1, of course. It has to be, because energy production is pointless if it isn't reliable. A society cannot function if it cannot keep the power on. Affordability is second. Americans need to be able to afford reliable energy without massive government subsidies so that they can drive to work, heat their homes, and benefit from a thriving economy. Third, Republicans want our energy to be clean. And yes, we can have energy that is reliable, affordable, and clean. It is possible. Also worth noting that America's natural gas revolution is the single largest factor in reducing America's carbon emissions. Switching from coal to gas accounted for 61% of emission reductions in the U.S. since 2005. If we cared about global emission reduction, we might note that the U.S. natural gas is 42% cleaner than Russian natural gas, which is why Republicans advocate for more natural gas exports to displace foreign coal, which, by the way, accounts for about 50% of total global power emissions. Seems that would be some pretty low-hanging fruit if carbon emissions was actually the goal. Also worth noting that Republicans are by far the strongest supporters of nuclear energy, which is both reliable and 100% clean. Maybe our colleagues would join us in fixing the outdated permitting process that makes a 4-year project last for 15 years. My Democrat colleagues mostly just want to talk about wind and solar, which isn't reliable and only affordable if you subsidize it. They say we can just build a bunch of batteries to deal with the intermittency problem of renewables. They say we can clear hundreds of square miles of land for solar and wind farms and pay China to mine and process all of our critical minerals so that we can pretend that we aren't actually responsible for the environmental devastation of Chinese mining practices and the enormous amount of emissions that result from processing it all. So my question to my colleagues is simple. If the goal is actually reducing global emissions, then will you work with us to improve our absurd environmental permitting regulations that are choking off our ability to not only build pipelines, but also build the solar and wind farms and battery backup systems that you claim you care so much about? I know some of them are because my friend Scott Peters was just talking about it. And surely my colleagues would find it troubling that something like the 10 West transmission line, whose groundbreaking ceremony was attended by Vice President Harris last year, won't actually be online until 2025. The planning actually started in 2016. Just for a simple 125-mile transmission line on public land. So that's nearly 10 years from start to finish, nearly 4 years of which was just to get the environmental impact statement approved. We put a man on the moon in less time than that. Does that seem like a healthy permitting and regulatory system to anyone? Surely not. It's not just transmission lines, it's critical minerals too. In Nevada, we couldn't build a lithium mine because of some useless plant called TM buckwheat. I'm not joking, you can look it up. In Oregon, we can't mine for lithium because of a sage grouse, which is basically just a fancy version of a chicken. In Minnesota, this administration halted the Twin Metals project over vague environmental concerns. Now, this mine would have produced taconite iron ore, copper, nickel, cobalt, all of which are needed for any renewable energy project. My point is this. The false narrative that we can transition smoothly to a wind and solar only future is not based on anything that resembles reality. It's a fantasy. And it's a dangerous one that will quickly take us down the failed energy scenario that we now see in Europe. Wind and solar certainly have their place. But when energy demand will increase by 50% over the next 50 years, intermittent renewables will never, ever, ever be enough. And it's time to let that fantasy go. So am I promoting oil and gas? Yes, I am. In fact, the quickest way to reduce global emissions would be to ensure that our cleaner natural gas is displacing foreign coal-fired power plants. That single feat would have a larger impact on global emissions than any other solution offered. In fact, the industry thinks we could quadruple gas exports in the next 10 years if we let them. If that gas displaced foreign coal, it would reduce emissions more than the combined impact of doubling our wind capacity, installing solar panels on every home, and electrifying every vehicle in the country. So you want solutions for reducing global emissions? Build pipelines, build export terminals, lease the land for drilling, and send some special trade reps to countries like India and Indonesia to make a deal. That's a realistic solution, and it's actually doable. Reality has to guide our solutions for the future. We cannot sacrifice energy reliability for radicalism. We must be rational environmentalists, not radical environmentalists. And we have to remember that the prosperity of the American people depends upon reliable and affordable energy. And I yield back.